Welcome to Winning Messages to Advance Pro-Housing Policy. I'm Therese Fitzgerald, Executive Editor of Multi-Housing News. Messaging is a critical part of changing attitudes and changing policies on housing. But while the affordable housing crisis is national, successful pro-housing messages must be local and nuanced to address the various constituencies and the historical circumstances in each vicinity. All of our speakers are involved in framing and conveying messages around housing, but their platforms and their purviews differ. And I think that's going to make this a really interesting conversation. Starting on my left, we have Matthew Lewis, Director of Communications for California YIMBY, Rosie Hepner, Senior Director, Terwilliger Center for Housing, Urban Land Institute, and Jason Rojas, Connecticut House of Representatives, Assembly District 9. Okay. To get to know our panelists a little bit, I'm going to ask a few introductory questions. Representative Rojas, what made you interested in helping to solve the housing crisis? And what has helped bring housing availability to the forefront of your policy agenda?
Sure, no, thank you everyone for being here, and certainly thank you to Up for Growth for inviting me to participate in the panel. I actually joked a little bit about my participation on this panel about winning messages, because I think like most of us, we're all in search of a winning message. So I'm here to hopefully learn from my fellow panelists, and if there's a Q&A part, learn from all of you about winning messages. And I think I got most interested on the question of housing via the question of education and segregation in our public schools. In Connecticut, there was a lawsuit that was recently settled called Sheff versus O'Neill, which was focused on desegregating Hartford public schools. I live in an inner ring suburb just outside of Hartford called East Hartford, and we weren't subject to that lawsuit, but for the last 30 years, we've spent about $4 or $5 billion on trying to desegregate Hartford public schools. And while significant progress has been made, as you might imagine, Hartford public schools are pretty segregated. And that moved me in the direction of, the ultimate solution, I think, to this is housing. As I got more into the question of housing, I began to learn a lot more about zoning and exclusionary zoning and the history of redlining and the role that local, state, and federal government has played in causing segregation and perpetuating it today. So that's really what drives me. And I think segregation, is really at the core of why our society is as polarized as it is. If we don't live next to each other, if we don't go to the same churches, if our kids don't go to the same schools or play in the same sports, we can't possibly understand each other's humanity. And I think that's really led to the polarization that we see across our country right now and in so many other facets. And of course, the housing issue also led me to a lot of interest in disparities around health and criminal justice and economic development and everything else. So I see housing as the crux of so many of the societal issues that we have today, in addition to just recognizing the very basic fact that everybody needs a place to live, a safe and healthy place to live.
Thank you. Ms. Hepner, what are some of the programs that ULI offers that helps inform how you understand direct community engagement?
Sure. So ULI, I think, is probably seen mostly as a voice for and tool for developers, and we certainly do work with developers a lot, and they're a big part of our members. For my work at the Terwilliger Center, we help elevate best practices in affordable housing and showing the business case so that we hope to help other developers do more of it. And there are other programs that ULI that really work with the community more than I think is seen or known. We have a wonderful program called Urban Plan that works with anyone from high school students to community members. There's a fictitious town, it's a game you play with Legos to kind of respond to an RFP and really balance all the places that a city would normally fear. It's pretty realistic. We have a few local chapters that have pretty robust housing programs working with the communities. ULI Atlanta spearheaded Housing TL. ULI San Francisco has been convening housing leaders for their Housing at Bay conference every year. And then lately we've been doing more direct engagement with communities through our technical assistance panels. So those are us bringing in a group of experts to a city that has requested our help with a particular land use challenge, and in my case, a housing challenge. And particularly the occupational analysis, which shows a mismatch between wages and home prices or rents, which can really speak to the business community and the city when we see exactly who we're talking about when we talk about who's priced out.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Lewis, what has been the most surprising thing for you so far about engaging with California housing policy?
Well, California is full of surprises on this topic. We don't get bored, which makes the work fun. It's also, I think it's important to remember that it's a pretty grave situation in California. It's bad, and I think I have to apologize on behalf of Californians. We've exported our problem to the whole country. I mean, talk to some Oregonians about how they feel about Californians these days. I think what's surprising, though, is that even given that current policy framework, when you go and ask people how they feel about the notion of more housing being built on their block, for example, people will kind of be like, well, it might be harder to park, but yeah, I guess we need more homes. And so I think there's some revelatory experiences in the sort of individual exchange around how people actually feel about housing versus where the politics are on housing, which is what we're finding with California YIMBY. One reason we've been able to find a lot of early success, we're a very young organization. We've been around for about 4 years. We've passed over a dozen pieces of pretty transformational housing policy in the state legislature in that time. And I like to think that it's because we're geniuses, but it's not actually the case. I have some very smart colleagues. I wish they were in this seat instead of me. But the reality is that people understand that people need homes, and they also can see visually that there's a shortage, right? Like, you experience it both through homelessness, and almost everyone knows someone who's struggling to pay the rent, or is behind on their mortgage, or is living in an overcrowded housing situation. And so what we've been able to capitalize on, that I think was surprising to me at the time, and when I explain this to people, it's surprising because you think, well, don't NIMBYs control California? And the reality is, they do, but not because there's a lot of them. They do because the structures have created leverage for them. And what we've been able to do with messaging, and I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian on the panel, because messaging only solves one particular problem. There's organizing, there's strategy, there's policy, there's collaboration, and all the other pieces. But we've been able to really pull people out of the woodwork around different messages, not one, but different messages that activate people to say, hey, wait a second, I don't agree with the NIMBY point of view. Like, there is, in fact, room for more housing on my block, and why isn't it getting built? And when you can lead people to that place of asking the question, you really open up opportunity for a whole bunch of solutions.
Okay. So now we'll dig into our discussion. Housing prices have become an increasingly large share of many Americans' budgets, with some people spending 50 to 60% of their monthly income on housing. With that in mind, what are some of the emerging trends in the narrative surrounding housing that you have all seen in your work? Who wants to start?
Mostly that it's expensive, I think, is probably the most dominant narrative that I think we're aware of. And I like to think Connecticut's unique, but I'm increasingly understanding that we're not. Other than, in Connecticut, there's no county level of government, so there's either state government, local government, and a state that has a deep affinity for the notion of local control, even though it's largely theoretical that there's local control, because local planning and zoning commissions derive all their power from state statute. So whenever we go to make changes about it, it becomes this very visceral fight about local control and telling us what to do. And, we never talk about what I think is really at the heart of it, right, which is those people moving into our communities. But it's becoming more and more public, particularly over the last couple of years in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. There's been a very strong movement in our state around tackling some of these issues that have been going on for a very long time. But I happen to be in the legislature right now and wanting to take up the mantle of fighting that fight. And I think we have a long road to go. So I think there is a recognition, as you noted, that there's a lot of my constituents, the average person who lives in our state, recognizes how much they're paying for housing and that there's a need for more housing and a variety of housing. But on the messaging piece, it's where we lose very quickly because local control, I think everybody thinks when you think about affordable housing that we're rebuilding Cabrini Green in everybody's neighborhood when that's not the case anymore. And I think we need to do a better job of articulating and explaining and showing in bright pictures what affordable housing looks like today versus what it looked like 60, 70 years ago.
Right, and it looks different in every area.
Right.
I think that, as soon as you illustrate the exact way it's being priced out, it can change some people. There are definitely people who don't care if their kid's child care worker can't live with them, but they might care about traffic. Maybe there are some people who care about having a more robust community, a more equitable community, and then others who don't, but don't want to pay for traffic. So maybe that's the end of talking, well, why do you think there is traffic? Because folks have to come here to work for you or work in the community and there's no place to live. And then other communities we're seeing are losing valuable members of what they think is their culture. We had learned when we were working in Boise earlier this year that Boise prides itself on a music scene. They have a wonderful music festival, and this is a city that does not want to be compared to Seattle or Portland. And we learned that they were losing musicians to Seattle and Portland. And this surprised the city. And it wasn't because Seattle or Portland was affordable. It was that as a musician, when you leave your venue at 2 o'clock in the morning, first of all, you can make more, a little bit more at the venue, and then when you leave at 2 o'clock in the morning, there's a way to get home, even if you can't live downtown or close to where you're performing. You have some way of getting there without having to own a car, which is another expense. And so that was very shocking for the city to hear, and definitely resonated with the community. They don't want to lose those folks, and I think that could translate to many other communities like New Orleans or Austin, and those types of those jobs that they really hold really as a center of their culture.
So the thing that I get me excited about the work we do at California YIMBY, I mean, most of the work we do internally is around actually developing policy, working with legislators and allies to write bills and then get them passed. But we also have what I think is a critical advantage of we're a movement, and we have volunteers all over the state, and it's actually, I mean, it used to be embarrassing to say to your friends, well, what did you do on Tuesday night? Oh, I'm busy, I'm going to a planning commission meeting, Like, who goes to a planning commission meeting for fun? Well, it turns out YIMBYs do. And so, and as a part of that, what happens is this ground truthing of the absurdity of the narrative is happening in real time. So whereas before you could have planning commissioners who would say things that would, I'm sure, offend everybody in this room. I mean, I think we all know what I'm talking about. Now you've got someone there writing it down and reporting it out, and people are sort of like, wait, that's why there's no homes? Really? Because this person, I'll give you an example from Berkeley where I live. There was an actual planning commission hearing about group housing. So it was targeted at lower income, but it was market rate. They were trying to bring down the cost so they could make the units accessible to lower income individuals. And this person went on a rant about the problems with shared bathrooms and how it would lead to premarital sex. And this just insane list of justifications for trying to block the housing from being built. Now, 15 years ago, that would have just been in the minutes, and that would have been the end of it. But because there were YIMBYs in the room who then shared that out, it ended up in the story about the project. And everybody was so embarrassed that it got approved. But this is actually, so we're talking about narrative here, okay? This is crucial. The people who've been blocking homes for the last 50 years have been getting away with this. And frankly, they're kind of lazy about it. They're not actually thinking like, oh, if I say this incredibly offensive thing, somebody might find out. And that might then set me back on my effort to make sure that this never gets built. Because now what's happening is they're saying this really offensive thing. More recently in Palo Alto, a woman actually compared YIMBYs to Nazis. That did not go over well. She ended up having to step down from the planning commission. She was a planning commissioner. But she did this publicly. And you have to think that like what makes an otherwise intelligent, grown adult person feel like they can get away with that is that they've been getting away with it. And so there hasn't been accountability. So a lot of what's happening in the narrative space is a giant accountability moment around people who have come to believe and expect that their, what I consider to be kind of repugnant views on community and housing are now being put into the light. And most people are like, whoa, 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 no, that is not really why we don't have housing. And when you look, you dig under, it's like, yeah, that is really why we don't have housing.
Okay. So you're saying that it's more public now, there's more accountability. And I think what you're saying is that now everyone's feeling the housing crunch, the whole scale down. And labor is something people are attuned to because they need labor for their businesses.
The worker, if I could just add to, the worker shortage thing has brought in a massive constituency from the business side because every business is struggling with this problem. And so your ability to recruit, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about a school that can't get teachers or, I mean, I'm in the Bay Area, we hear from tech firms and founders and venture capitalists who are saying, I can't convince an engineer to move to the Bay Area for $250,000 a year because they were like, no way, I can't afford a house with that kind of money.
Right.
Yeah, that was a major kind of outcome of a gathering that the Yale School of Management held earlier this month, where they brought in a lot of prominent business leaders, political leaders from around the state. And it was really interesting to hear a couple of previously Republicans who ran for governor very much talking about the housing shortage and how it's making it difficult for them to attract talent, and in particular, young workers. So, there's a bit of optimism out there that the next generation of workers will go out there and demand that there be a greater variety of housing. But it's helpful to have, and I've said this to business groups before, you are all corporate leaders with a huge bully pulpit. Yeah. It would be helpful if you started talking about housing rather than just taxes and regulations and the usual things that corporate leaders talk about.
Right. We've already talked about some of the NIMBY arguments that are out there today. But which of these arguments do you see getting the most traction?
From the NIMBY side of things?
Yeah, which NIMBY arguments are getting the most traction or the most attention?
Yeah, I mean, at least in Connecticut, right, it's this, very suburban state. We don't have very large urban cities. Largest city in Connecticut's 130,000 people. So it's the fear of density and what it's going to do to the character of your community. And we even had legislation 2 years ago that we were looking to remove that provision from our Zoning Enabling Act that talked about planning and zoning commissions being able to stop projects if it was going to impact the character of their community. And we were able to change that and make it more specific to architectural design, those types of things. But the fear of density in a very suburban state is something that still carries a lot of weight for people who are concerned about even a 3- or 4-story building going up a block away from a Metro North train stop, which seems absurd to me, but is very much a serious battle in one of our communities down on what we call the Gold Coast.
Agree. I think density and also just crowding, whatever that means to people, traffic, less parking, schools, whatever they think that translates to. I think there's an understanding that if they just block housing, none of the newcomers come in. They don't realize actually that you have free movement of people in this country, and they're still going to move in. It's the folks that live there for a very long time that suffer. I think there's also, I think it's dying out, I hope it is, there's also just the fear and weird misconceptions around renters and how a lot of what's being built is for renters. More anecdotally from my own community listserv, the way some of the older homeowners speak about renters disgusts me.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
very, they're not invested in the community. I don't know, they speak about them like they're not a human being. Whereas I live really close to a big apartment building. There are people who lived in that apartment building long before I moved into my house. There are homes down the street from me that I've seen sell once or twice ever since I've lived there, and yet they're more invested in the community. It's nonsense.
Yeah.
I think, I'm hoping it dies out just because we have so many renters and people who will remain renters, because it's so hard to become a homeowner at this point. And I just hope that the whole notion of renting just becomes a little more less stigmatized.
And there's renters by choice, of course, too.
As you should. I think the pandemic has only, and just our shift to more remote work, has given people great flexibility to live wherever they want, whenever they want, move around as they care to.
I mean, we see it all in California as far as what the NIMBYs try to get away with. I think the ones, though, that there's two that sort of are problematic, but I think the houser community can really pretty straightforwardly address. So a very common strategy, particularly in a state like California, where it's really it's mostly Democrats, and so you can't really run in most of the urban areas on the coast anyway. You're not going to run as a conservative. You're certainly not going to run as a Republican. So you're all trying to position around progressive, centrist, democratic politics. So what we hear a lot is people who, if you look back at the record 10, 15 years ago, they were just sort of a normal NIMBY, right? Because, again, there weren't as many people paying attention. But now what they figured out is they can achieve the same goal by saying, no, we only want 100% affordable housing, or going for an inclusionary level that everybody knows won't pencil. And it's a very cynical way to approach it, but there's a good news piece of that. What they figured out is they can no longer just say they oppose housing. That's the good part. The bad part is because most people just don't understand how housing works, and that includes people who are struggling. I mean, it's a technical topic. If you're not steeped in the finance and the zoning and the planning and the permitting and the bonds for affordability and the low-income housing tax credit, it's a whole technical universe. And I think one of the messages I wanted to deliver here today is a reminder to us that we are the only people who get this. So we have an obligation to then explain to everyone else in ways that they can understand that there's actually, when we use the term affordable housing, we mean two different things. To the average person, it means a place I can afford, period. They're not necessarily thinking like, oh, I've got to go apply for Section 8, or I've got to go into the county and register for the lottery or whatever it is. They're like, I can't find an apartment I can afford. And so there are NIMBYs who are taking advantage of that and saying, oh, well, these people don't want to build any housing for you because it's not affordable. Well, again, affordable means two things, right? So the challenge we have is we are so behind in housing production that if we threw everything at the wall all at once, we would still have years of affordability challenges. That's the math of where we are with the housing shortage, right? So you've got to we do need to come up, I think, probably the biggest orphaned task right now for us is figuring out where the funding's going to come from to bridge that gap. But as far as the NIMBY messaging itself, they are successfully blocking housing by making arguments for unrealistic levels of affordability. It's a problem because in messaging, the rule is if you're explaining, you're losing, right? So part of what we're looking at is doing more educational campaigns to sort of spread awareness of what do we actually mean when we say these terms. Again, we do have the benefit of having a movement of people. So California NIMBY has about 85,000 members in California. And they are sort of there's nothing, we couldn't buy that amount of messaging help. Because you got people all over the state in the communities basically saying what I just said. Look, we mean two different things. And you've got to be able to disseminate it at that level. We're making a lot of progress. So I think, again, the fact that the NIMBYs are no longer straight up, those people can go somewhere else. And now they're saying, okay, affordable only and at this level. And people are starting to realize, but wait, that also resulted in no housing. Mm-hmm. So.
In Connecticut, there was an interesting argument being made now that, we should focus less, on high-density housing because how do you help poor people build generational wealth, right? As if paying 50 or 60% of your income in rent is going to help you get to developing generational wealth. But
Same
It's out
story.
there, same
Same
story,
story,
right.
yeah.
But even when you do, there's just around the corner from where I live, a development proposal, 100% affordable housing. Net zero too. I mean, what else could you ask for? It's on a bus and bike. There's a bike lane in front of it, a bus line going through it. It's 14th Street corridor. This is where these projects should be getting built. And they're still arguing. I mean, there's always something. That
Yeah.
it's the people who live nearby, the shadows, or whatever. There's always something.
Okay, well, we talked about the labor question, or the labor argument, pro-housing argument. What are some of the other successful pro-housing arguments out there that seem to be reaching people?
We've had recent major success connecting the dots with climate change. It's something, so my background was actually in climate policy, and my story of coming to housing was I worked in climate and energy policy for 20 years, and I was along the way able to buy a house in Berkeley, very lucky, like I could never do it now, and started to wonder, like, why has there not been any growth in this town forever and ever? And just by chance and talking to different folks I knew in the climate science field, I became aware that infill housing is actually the #1 climate strategy in coastal California. There's nothing that comes close. And the state has known this for decades. I mean, there's a law that was passed in the second law passed in like 2012 that basically required communities in California to be looking at the location of housing as it relates to trip generation for cars and vehicle miles traveled and then the pollution that's associated with that. But the state didn't actually do anything to follow up. But because the climate movement, along with other movements, you mentioned George Floyd, and like there's a little bit of a convergence now happening in urban activism. These are areas that did not really connect 10 years ago, and now they really kind of are. I would say sometimes productively, sometimes it's challenging, because these are very diverse organizations with sometimes different goals, but where there's alignment happening is on this question of don't make me drive so far, right? There's actually a lot of people, and if you just look at the market, it's pretty obvious. Americans want to live in walkable neighborhoods. I mean, these are the highest priced homes in the country, are places you can walk, take a bus, walk to the grocery store, drop your kids off at daycare, like around the corner, or by bike, or what have you. Prices have meaning in this context. And so I think people are sort of seeing, okay, you're pricing me out of the place where I don't have to drive. I know I care about climate change, so I want to drive less, but you're prohibiting me from doing that. And the argument's been so effective that I'm very happy to say that on Thursday, Governor Gavin Newsom, just last week, signed into law AB 2097. It's the first statewide ban on parking minimum mandates in the United States. And in his signing message, he actually said, I am doing this because the parking mandates we put on our housing projects are forcing people to drive more and driving up climate pollution. And so it's sort of like once you have the governor's validation, I mean, he's got to do his whole dance around his constituents and his agencies and all the climate groups and make sure that it's... So I actually think there is a broader convergence happening around that particular set of issues, because not just in California but across the country, the need to get people affordable housing closer to where they do most of their activities is a critical climate strategy. It is a must-pass set of policy changes that we have to have if we're going to solve climate change in this country. And not only is it good policy, but it's great politics, because climate action is very popular in American cities in particular, but also really, it's actually popular across the country. I know we get caught up in the politics in Washington, D.C., but I promise you, when you go to Kansas, those people care about climate change too.
I would say proof of concept helps a lot. We've had a few developers on the Terwilliger Center Advisory Board who face all sorts of NIMBYs during the development process and get yelled at in community meetings and things like that. And then once it gets built, people are like, oh, this is a nothing burger. I don't know why, And then maybe they'll even, a few of them are like, oh, now they only want us to be the ones working in the, they really like what ended up being built. And what comes from it, whether it's new retail or whatever, they see the benefit of it. So that, it's not making huge changes, but it does have a small impact. But going back to labor, I think that is a huge, huge influence on folks. And you see just exactly if I ask my mom, what does affordable housing mean to her, across the street from her, they put up a, 5-story affordable development. Who does she think is going to live there? She might think it's going to be homeless drunk people.
Right,
And it's
right,
awful.
right.
And that's what a lot of people think
That's what a lot of
it is.
people, yeah.
And they don't realize that it's not just DC or California anymore. It is, I presented last week to the Colorado Springs Chamber of Commerce, it's all these jobs that honestly, beyond, whatever cultural amenities your community has, these are jobs that literally a community can't survive without. EMTs, nurses, teachers, delivery truck drivers, especially after this pandemic. So many jobs that if no community is making space for them, I'm not sure what happens next, right? So, and we've been hearing, I think every week from a community, usually a business owner that is just really struggling to retain workers.
Right.
And Park City, Utah talked to us a couple months ago. They have to close ski lift operations early.
Right.
What happens to, all these mountain towns, especially folks living in them all year round, what happens when they get pushed out? I mean, what happens when you can't run a mountain?
Right.
Then nobody was going to want to go there.
Yeah, it's about finding commonalities, I think, labor, climate. Okay. Opposition to new building projects is a problem across the political spectrum. How do you think about targeting messaging or shifting your narratives based on the different ideological interests of various groups? More broadly, how do you think about message targeting?
Yeah,
Looking to you.
I think it's something that we need to figure out how to do. I think, in listening to the responses to the last question, in Connecticut, often seen as a very blue state, I'd say it's some shade of blue rather than blue that we think about in terms of our politics, because it's actually quite conservative and regressive on a lot of things, particularly around race and class. And as Democrats begin to continue to pick up seats in areas that we've never really represented before, it becomes more of a political problem for my party, because we have these people who I think we have colleagues who know the problems that we face, are open to some of the solutions that we have, but the political consequences of acting on those are very real. And we could certainly criticize them and say they should stand up and just do the right thing, absolutely. But I also like to have a larger caucus so that we can deliver on the rest of our platform as well, too. So I think a lot of folks in Connecticut understand the climate issue. They complain about transportation. They understand affordability, but they're not quite making the connection to the housing question yet. I think we have a lot of work to do on that.
Yeah, I think it's just more personal than political because you see it across no matter someone's political beliefs. Again, just going back to my community listserv, a woman on there, she works in the environment for a major organization that will remain nameless. Would probably believe in climate change and all the other things, and yet against bus lanes, against bike lanes. She also works for an anti-poverty organization. Right. Maybe I'm giving away too much. Against affordable housing.
You might know her.
And it's just mind-boggling. This is someone who definitely has a sign in front of their house about
In this house, we believe.
And yet, the first person to respond about anything and try not just that, mobilize people. Or if sometimes I put myself out there, immediately responds to me, oh, you shouldn't believe in this. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, and so I think it becomes personal at the end of the day, no matter someone's politics, because I've always felt that this should be a really easy win across, if you're really conservative or libertarian, zoning should make your head spin.
Right.
It should be a very easy thing to say.
I've tried making that argument in committee.
you
It fell
tried.
pretty flat with my conservative colleagues.
There are so many things that, believe that housing can help solve. So it just becomes personal.
I just hope for everybody's mental health that you just never go on next door. Just as a,
It's awful.
just recommend not going there. For those of you not familiar, a lot of bad stuff happens there. So something I wanted to mention that I'm a part of. So I know there's, I ran into a woman earlier who's with a philanthropy who's investing in housing narrative work, and I'm actually part of a housing narrative collaborative through the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And one of a hugely valuable piece of research that they did in California was a very large sample of Californians to sort of gauge where people come down on housing issues. And they came up with 5 archetypes. So these things are a little bit reductive, so you've got to be careful about drawing too many conclusions from them. But they sort of showed, what types of, not the messages specifically, but what types of message frames would get people to engage and agree with you on different types of housing topics. And what they found, and I would encourage everybody, I believe it's on the Chan Zuckerberg website, if you look up the Chan Zuckerberg Housing Narrative Project. But what they found was there's 4 archetypes that are on a spectrum of like, well, we don't really think that housing is that big a problem, but if it is, people can figure it out and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, all the way over to a very more radical proposition, which is the problem is capitalism and financialization of housing, and we just need to blow up the whole system so that people can have homes. But in between those groups is the nuanced, interesting set of audiences where you can sort of say, well, who are we actually talking to, and where are they on the spectrum, and so how do I talk to them based on who I think they are? At the far other end of the spectrum is sort of the lost cause group. And I think we just need to acknowledge that there is such thing as political conflict on this and all other topics, and that means there's going to be opposition who just don't share your values. And I think that something that's been difficult in the housing conversation, and I know it was the case in the climate conversation, is we tend to be conflict averse, but the problem is that the people who are blocking housing are in conflict with us already. They are stopping us from doing something that we think is a necessary good. So I encourage people to not shy away from those oppositional messages as well, and there's a really important reason. They're a tiny minority of the population. It's like 10% of people who are like, not only is it not a problem, but I don't want these people near me. It might be more in Connecticut. I don't mean to be.
Well, and I was going to say, I don't know if it matters once it gets on the Facebook, right?
But when they say, I don't want any immigrants here, I don't want any outsiders here, I don't care where my kids go, I don't care where the teachers go, we have enough housing here, this is not my problem. Okay, so there's no message that's going to reach that person. And myself as a practitioner, I'm going to make sure that they get quoted in the newspaper. Because I want everybody to see who is stopping housing and what their values are. Because I know that those other 4 segments, all 4 of them, will look at some of the things I say and be like, oh, really? You really said that out loud? Because they mean it. And I think in fairness, it's sort of like they get to be who they are, and we as a community get to say, that's not who we are. But there's a role in messaging and helping make sure that that's in there, because part of the problem in organizing and advocacy communications, if you tell someone there isn't an opponent, well, why hasn't this happened yet? Oh, it's just like this weird bureaucratic. Well, you're giving them permission to say, okay, well, then I don't need to do anything. If there's nobody in opposition, then it's just going to happen, right? But that's not how it actually works. There is somebody in opposition, and we have to overcome that opposition to make it happen. So figuring out who those 4 groups are and who the 5th one is was super valuable, because now I, as a practitioner, can isolate the group that's in opposition and activate the 4 that I know in the different channels will actually get active on this.
One of the concerns we hear from communities regarding building more homes is that it will lead to the devaluation of personal property. How do you all think about responding to that?
Well, you try to show them data or research on it, and they're just like, I don't believe it. Right? I mean, there's a level of like kind of perverse rational self-interest at play here for folks who think, right, the biggest investment they ever make is their house, and now there's the threat to it. And despite this report in front of me that shows that won't happen, doesn't matter, I still believe it. And I don't know if that's a universal kind of cognitive dissonance going on around the country, but
It is, and actually, I don't know if there's anybody here from the National Association of Home Builders or National Association of Realtors, but there's a hugely valuable campaign that somebody with a much bigger budget than I have could run right now around these high-level educational issues, public service announcements about this topic. So I use myself as an example. So I bought my house in Berkeley in 2012. It has gone up a lot. I mean, it's insane. During that time, there's been a new Section 8 apartment housing complex built on my block. They just got certificate of occupancy across the street from me on an extremely low-income housing project on church property, across the street. I promise you, the value of my house has not gone down a tiny little bit, not at all. And there's even evidence from here in Arlington, a case study that we did at California YIMBY, where there was a whole community, somebody might be familiar with this, I'm talking.
There was an urban study in Alexandria.
Thank you, where they built some low-income housing in a neighborhood, and the neighbors were all freaked out that it was going to lower their property values, and it turned out they went up. Here's the reason, there's a very simple explanation for this, which is that when you allow more housing in a city, you increase the value of the city. A city is more valuable with more people in it. And I think that that's sort of lost on folks who are like, but what about my little house? It's like, that includes your little house, if your house is in the city. But there's a very commonly known line in cognitive psychology theory that informs a lot of communications theory, that where fear comes from. And it comes from not understanding something.
The unknown.
But it's also adaptive. Like, it's not a flaw in human behavior. It's actually like a highly adaptive, positive trait. It's good to be afraid of something you're not familiar with, in a way. I mean, in a complex conversation like this, it doesn't help. But so the task of communicators is to figure out, how do I assuage that fear? And what I found works, at least with some of my neighbors, is I say, well, they build very low-income housing across from me, and my house is still worth way more than $1 million. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess mine is too, you know?
Speaking of politics, Representative Rojas, you recently worked within Connecticut's legislative body to advocate for pro-housing policies. Could you speak a little bit about your work and what some of the arguments were that moved people?
Yeah, I mean, we had a pretty robust debate in both the 21 session and the 22 session around transit-oriented development. You know, if you're familiar with Connecticut, we have I-95, we have Metro North, one of the busiest rail lines in the country, and wanting to just have as-of-right housing along those transit corridors, within a quarter mile of a transit corridor. And it also included not only trains, but buses. And, you know, we weren't successful with that. And, you know, we were talking about 4 units type of thing, or, you know, a minimum size on an acre type of thing. Nothing that, I don't think that was all that extreme, but we weren't able to get it done. And I'd been advocating for a fair share plan for Connecticut too, kind of similar to what New Jersey did 30 years ago, 40 years ago, in which we would determine how much housing it is we think we need. And then we would allocate that housing to municipalities, and they would be charged with developing their own plan on how to meet that goal. Again, you know, didn't pass as well, died in the Judiciary Committee, I think particularly because one of the provisions in terms of enforcing it, would essentially allow like anybody to sue another community if they weren't living up to their plan or the goal that they were responsible for. So we'll have to figure out how we ensure enforceability of it without allowing everybody in the world to levy a lawsuit against a community who may not be making progress on achieving that housing goal. But those are the 2 primary policy issues that we tried to push over the last biennium. You know, and again, we've made incremental steps. We were able to have some ADU legislation pass, but even to get that passed, we had to make an exception that towns could opt out of it. And as you might imagine, the towns that were opposed to it are now opting out of allowing ADUs as of right in their communities.
Okay. Okay, we want to leave some time for some questions.
No, a lot of hands.
Why don't we start here and work our way that way?
So, Matt, I'm going to have to deal with my existential crisis of staying positive as a local leader later with you, but because you're saying draw attention to the negative, and I'm like, I don't know. But the question I'm going to stick with here, Luca Tonicelli, YIMBYs of Northern Virginia founder, here representing YIMBY Action, hey. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on the environmental sustainability aspects of of the merits of housing policy. There's a lot of emphasis placed on the racial justice and social justice aspects. The economic leg of the stool doesn't really get as much attention. My working theory is because it then draws attention to like greedy developers. Have you been able to square that circle? Because as you say, and I think multiple panelists said, if we get this right, everyone's going to be so much better off. The economy is going to boom. What are your thoughts on that?
So there's a real problem and a fake problem that I see in that. The real problem is inequality and the lack of wage growth among lower income earners. And it's the challenge is that even though it's not really the role of housing policy to solve that, it doesn't change the fact that people who are being victimized by the shortage are suffering from that consequence. So we kind of end up being forced to talk about, which by the way, I think wage inequality is a travesty in this country, right? So, but it's not my job to sort of figure out how to solve wage inequality. I can't avoid talking about it though, because it does influence what happens with housing. So I think this is where you get into the intersectionality of the issue and the need to sort of figure out how do we make sure that we're both hearing those concerns, which are very, very real for people. I mean, this is like their day-to-day, you know. I'm making $15 an hour, you're telling me I've got to come up with $2,000 a month rent, you're crazy, okay? And that's true, it's crazy. But I can't solve that with zoning reform. I can't solve that with, ADU permitting. I can't solve that with banning parking mandates. There's just not a tool in my toolkit to get at the wage question. So that's the first piece, is that it is, as much as cities are the engines of opportunity and people move to them because it generally increases their economic outcome, generally, there's enough people who've been left behind by that and who aren't being lifted up by that paradigm where I'm sort of like, well, first of all, sign me up for universal basic income or something like it, because it's like people shouldn't be pushed out of their homes just because a bunch of new folks moved in and now the rent went up. But I do have an answer to that second part, which is we can dramatically reduce the pressure on your rent if you let us do these other things, okay? So the reason housing is getting more expensive isn't because, I know it's crazy to say now, but in the old days, housing depreciated. It's true, it did. It used to track the CPI. You can go look at the data, and a house would just barely keep up with the consumer price index. For decades, that was true in this country. So it was like, you weren't doing it for a speculative investment. You were like, well, I just don't want to pay the landlord or I want to stay in this community. That's changed in the last 20 years, right? So there's been a divergence of that trend. So I think to the first part of your economic question, the second part of the economic question, this is frankly where the political power is being built. Because you've got businesses that are saying, I am either closing or leaving, because it's not just my employees who can't afford to live here. I can't afford to live here. Like I've had CEOs and tech VCs and people say, sorry to put it this way, but like their daycare is gone, whatever was working at their house was gone. They're sort of like, this is insane. These people were making enough to be able to have a decent middle class income, except they live in the Bay Area, so that's just wildly unrealistic. And if you trickle that across the whole economy, nurses can't afford to live in the Bay, teachers can't afford to live in the Bay, firefighters can't afford to live in the Bay. It's almost everybody who can't pull it off. And so if you go up the chain to the people with the power over them, and they're like, this is a crisis. So we've been able to capitalize on that part of the economic opportunity argument with people who actually have the ability to sort of both, donate, first of all. We're a nonprofit organization, we need donors. So we get donations from business leaders in tech and in that sort of community because they're seeing the results of it. But it's also, taking that message to Sacramento has a lot of sway. The state legislature cares deeply about the business community in the state. It's complicated. I wish they cared less about the oil industry, but the oil industry is a big player in California, so, but it's the same is true for the rest of the economy. So I think it's figuring out who those folks are, from Main Street businesses to big multinationals in your community, and saying, look, this is your problem. If they don't already know it, I promise, they're gonna figure out it is their problem, because that's what's happened where we are. And the community feels like, I think they got caught a little flat-footed with it, and so they're really racing to the front now to try to be a part of the solution.
Do we have time for more questions?
Oh, yeah, we have about a half hour for questions, so, or 20 minutes, so.
Hi, I'm asking a question on behalf of a virtual attendee. Henry H. asks, who do you see as the most important persuadable audiences to winning bold pro-housing policy, and what are the values you suggest leading with when talking to them?
Yeah, I think we have to take a kind of a barbell approach, right? It's the young person with a lot of college debt who's trying to find a job and needs an affordable place to live. And then we have seniors at the other end, which, it's probably a bit difficult to get to that group on a lot of issues, but seniors who no longer, at least in the case of Connecticut, no longer want the 4,000, 5,000 square foot house in a suburb or want something that's close to a lot of cultural amenities, social amenities, living in downtown areas. I think those are the two groups I think we need to approach to build a coalition to address this issue. I mean, families, the big in the middle too, right? Or individuals without families who are just looking for a place to live. They're very important too. But in terms of the energy that we're seeing out of this next generation of workers, and certainly folks at the other end of the spectrum who vote regularly.
Yeah, the folks who aren't in the room who are probably renters and will benefit the most from those policies or programs. I think they're the ones, your future residents, if you will, those who could move into the apartment building if it got built or whatever. I think they're very important. I agree, seniors. We were in Austin a few weeks ago. It was in July. And, we spoke to some seniors who, maybe $20,000 a year, and the homes around them are just getting purchased up by California experts. Being torn down and these McMansions for $5 million are being built. This is not upzoning, it's just for displacement, and they feel that pressure because there's no state income tax, and so their property taxes are just skyrocketing. And in the case that many of these folks do live in single-story bungalow type homes that are very easy to age, stay in place. They probably need just some home repairs, but it's just not something that's being prioritized by the city, and needs to be and also just to make it more desirable to make those home repairs rather than tear downs, especially when you're just replacing it with a single-family home.
I'm a crass opportunist, so my answer is if you're on my side, you're on my side, kind of. But that said, the AARP is kind of the original YIMBY organization. I don't think people realize that. They have been working on this notion of both downsizing and right-sizing your home for 20 years longer. And they've got programs of outreach to senior citizens all over the country on this specific topic. So we haven't done a lot of deliberate messaging to that audience, but we have a ton of members who are in that audience. And I think it's because it sort of makes sense. Like, you're either an empty nester or you're on a fixed income and you're seeing all these phenomena around you and you're looking around saying, like, well, where am I going to go? I lived in a car-dependent part of town for so many years, but gosh, my vision's going. What am I going to do? And so there's actually a very urgent need for that community to find solutions, and they are very actually good YIMBYs. I mean, they're good at it. When they show up, it's great. I think we could do a lot more of that.
And of course, we have to tread carefully with that because we've all seen the age-restricted, over 55 type of housing. Those are easy to get developed in any community, right? There's no threat there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
No, that's
but,
right.
at some point, this bubble that we're in, this demographic bubble that we're in, will sadly come to a close. And I don't know what will become of all that age-restricted housing.
But the flip side of that is you have a lot of people who own their homes whose children are struggling to find housing.
Right.
They would like to either give their home to their children.
My sister-in-law just bought my mother-in-law's house.
So, for example, or they'd like to add on to it so they can do multi-generational living. In fact, in LA, we get a lot of people asking, how can I do multi-generational? And the answer is, sorry, you can't.
Right.
Because it's illegal. So there's a pent-up demand there for a lot of this stuff, and a lot of it is being driven by the retirement wave that's coming and all these sorts of things.
Great panel. My name's Catherine. I'm from Smart Growth America. I had two questions. One is you've spoken a lot about bringing different constituencies in to become pro-housing advocates. It'd be great to hear more about, who you're finding your primary constituency is. Who do you find this message initially has resonated with, and how have you grown that tent? And that's for YIMBY, but also in Connecticut, I've followed Desegregate Connecticut and the activism there. And then I'll add a second question, since I'm sure there's a lot. You also talked a bit about defining that opposition, and I think something which is interesting about the term YIMBY is it's a response to NIMBY, and so that's clearly intentional. I've heard, there's other pro-housing groups, Abundant Housing or Neighbors for More Neighbors. Can you talk to us, since we're in a communications session, about the kind of branding and what works, what doesn't, when you take that opposition framing approach?
Yeah, I mean, I continue to harp on young people, and young people being like anybody from 22 to like 35 now, right? 35 is a new young. And I think it's particularly to get to that group as younger people hold off on having children too, because I think something happens when you have children. Your kind of psychology changes, and I think you become, you start to slowly move towards the NIMBY crowd once you have children, because you fear that there's going to be some impact on your child's education, and therefore you become opposed. So the longer that young people can hold off on having children, I think, not good for our country, but certainly maybe good for our movement here, to keep them in our camp in terms of ensuring that there's greater variety of housing. So.
Well, I don't really work with communities in that way to do messaging, so I'll probably stick around.
I mean, I surprise everyone when I say this, but the median YIMBY in California is a woman between the age of 53 and 65. Now, that's not what you would see if you think that YIMBYs are just something that happen on Twitter. But most YIMBYism isn't happening online. It's actually happening in communities at City Hall and in the activism. And I think what seems to be bringing them in is the sort of sets of concerns I've raised, and for reasons that I actually I know that I'm not as informed as I'd like to be on this, but I think there's just a lot more responsibility that's being put on mothers in particular in that age range around sort of planning around, where are my kids going to go, right? Where are my parents going to go? And they're sort of stuck in between. In California, this is really just like, it's crisis levels for families all over the state. So you might be securely housed. Your kids might have like a sort of okay housing situation. Your parents might sort of have an okay housing situation. But you're looking at it and it's very tenuous. So it's very nervous making for people thinking, gosh, like, what can I do to like alleviate this? There's someone in my family who's a teacher. My daughter's a teacher. She's got nowhere to go. My mother is retired and on a fixed income, and she's going to get priced out. And so this is one of the things that we're finding a lot of in the work that we do. And frankly, the important part is the people who show up and do the work. It's like so they will send the emails, they will come to the meetings, they will make the phone calls, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where you start to accumulate the actual actions taken, which results in policy change. On the second question, this was a debate a couple of years ago about whether YIMBY name was a good idea. And we took a lot of heat for it. And we're sort of like, so I've done a lot of branding for organizations in my career. And it's kind of like, it's a little bit arbitrary. Anything that is well executed will become known. So it's sort of like, people are probably going to leave this thing and go take an Uber. Well, it's just a car. It's not an Uber. But we call it an Uber because it just became the thing that stuck. So there's a certain amount of it, which is YIMBY has become the thing that stuck. I think there was a debate with advocates in Minnesota in particular who didn't like the oppositional sort of frame of YIMBY versus NIMBY. And they actually also got a lot of good work done in Minnesota. So maybe they knew their market better. I don't know that they would have had more or less success if they had decided to call themselves YIMBY. What I know is that they've been pretty successful. So I'm sort of like, I don't care. If it's I think the thing is the YIMBY movement was born specifically in strident opposition to NIMBYs. And I mean, there's a woman from San Francisco, you may have heard of, Sonia Traus. She made a name for herself being the louder person in the room on the question of housing. And in a city like San Francisco, where there are a lot of loud people on housing. So to figure out how to be louder than them was quite a feat. And so the YIMBY movement sort of attracted a lot of people who are like, you know what? If solving housing requires me to be loud, then I am going to be loud. And that's sort of the genesis of the movement. So I think there is also that piece of it, which is we call ourselves a part of the pro-housing movement. The pro-housing movement is all over the place, and different organizations will come up with different names for themselves. And I think I really say, like, whatever you think will work in your community, that's what you should call yourselves.
Yeah, and to your comment about Desegregate Connecticut, which I work with them and I appreciate their work, the name itself has become troublesome, I think, in the debate we're having in Connecticut about it, and largely because I think most of the policies that they were advocating for were just good housing policy and not necessarily going to do anything related to segregation. And then for my colleagues of color, they somewhat take offense to that approach because there's this kind of the other side of the coin is why do our people have to move somewhere, right, to get access to opportunity, and the insinuation that we need to be near wealthy white people to be successful. And that's a difficult tension that we're trying to manage ourselves to. And there's the legitimate concern, what about our housing stock in the cities? Because what's really getting built in the cities is market rate apartments that most of our constituents of color or low income constituents can't afford.
While I don't get to lobby or do anything, I'll say I like YIMBY just because
Yay.
housing's just so challenging and it's different in every community. I mean, we went to Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. Again, as someone who lives in DC, not a place that I think of as unaffordable, but for the people who live there, it's very unaffordable. And so to be able to, that it's a message that, yes, in my backyard, or what in your backyard, it can mean different things in different communities. It needs to be kind of open for interpretation of what's appropriate for that community, because it's not going to be the same in Boise and Austin and DC and San Francisco. Everything's going to look different, whereas these other messages can, I mean, housing's just so hard to put in one word or four words or one sentence that, like, this is just a nice, clean way of getting at it, you know?
Yeah.
My question is on, I think it's important to be introspective also on the kind of the branding of the YIMBY movement as well. And I think part of the messaging is also a part of who is delivering the message. And oftentimes I feel like the right voices aren't being uplifted to deliver the message in a way that it lands the best with certain populations. So what are your thoughts on that? What are according to all of you, how are YIMBYs perceived, and who do you think should be the best messengers of pro-housing policy?
These are great questions.
Yeah, it's probably
Yeah,
nobody in
questions.
this room, right? No, and no, please don't take offense. Me neither, right? As you know, the guy who wears like a fancy little blazer, right? Probably not the best messenger to the people who are going to be most impacted by this. So, you know, how do you raise the voices of tenants and renters, who are often kind of a set-aside group, right? They don't own. You know, the misconception they don't pay property taxes as if it's not embedded into their rent. You know, how do you really raise those voices? And do those individuals have the time to come to the National Press Club and have this conversation or participate in a public hearing at the state capitol? Probably not. So we certainly need a lot more community activists or advocacy organizations who can get really affected at mobilizing people to reach out to their legislators on these issues because we're not hearing from them.
Last week when I was on a panel with A.J. Jackson, who's with JBG Smith here in DC, and he's here today, I saw him. You know, he was talking about how they really just, you know, with all their projects, they found, you know, just a few members of the community that would benefit from, you know, the developments and the work that they were doing. And because their time is precious and they don't have the luxury of spending 6 hours in a community meeting or whatever, they really just made a point of asking them to be there for the meetings that matter the most.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, not scheduling them, that's like a very weird way of saying it, but, you know, being very judicious and using their time to what was going to be the most effective. I think that can really go probably a long way in getting the right people in the room, the people that are actually the beneficiaries, without expecting them to do all the work or spending all the time, you know, whether their jobs are not necessarily 9 to 5, which these meetings can tend to cater to. I mean,
Yeah.
I have a pretty flexible work environment, and I can't even, you know, as a mom, at these 7 o'clock meetings, like, are you kidding me? You know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's really hard, and so, you know, finding the time for, especially when you're asking women or, moms to show up to these things, like, okay, you only have to be there at this time. Arranging childcare is even better.
Yeah.
Right, and to that point too, Zoom has been amazing for our process in Connecticut where we held public hearings via Zoom. And we should continue that into the future because it allowed the individual who lives across the state to have their voice heard before a committee that they otherwise would just not have the time to go sit at the Capitol, wait 7 hours for your 3 minutes to speak, and then you leave, right? Who has time for that?
Yeah.
So technology, I think, can help us in this effort.
So I'm going to answer with a slightly contrarian take because so I completely agree with you. And the reasons you end up with the voices you hear are because of the structural inequities in the way the whole process works. This has been really deeply studied. There's a woman at Yale who with a report, if you go to I have to give a little plug for California YIMBY's homework newsletter, because all we do is we promote the research on this. But she actually looked at public input processes across the country, and it's pretty established at this point that these are just heavily biased toward older white people. So the voices that are being given the opportunity to speak are older white people. So if you're going to say, well, okay, so, and I'm sorry that even Zoom doesn't fully solve that problem. There's
Absolutely.
technology barriers for people. They don't have high-speed internet, whatever else it might be. So the process itself is structurally inequitable and racist. I'm just use that word because it is. That's what the results show. So the challenge becomes from a messaging standpoint, given that you can't sort of insert people into that process. It's very hard to get people to go to these meetings, to your point. And that's if you're a professional with the inclination and like et cetera, like trying to get someone who's struggling to pay the rent to then leave their job to go to a hearing, that's just a not viable proposition. So there's sort of two pieces that I think are really important. One is for those of us who do look like me and have the power to actually use it in the way that we do to try to achieve these structural reforms. That's one. It's not good enough. That's nowhere near good enough. The other is to start pointing a finger at these processes that actually are exclusionary by design and saying, we need to change this so that those voices have a specific way to be inserted into it. Because I can't do that as the Director of Communications for California YIMBY. I mean, if I can get someone quoted in a news story or featured in our newsletter, that's fine, but that's not shifting power. That's not necessarily, that's helping advance a narrative around what we're doing. I think that the work we do around helping people engage the process from where they are is frankly some of our highest value work. So we can help those people who are disenfranchised from the system. It's like, look, send this when you have time. Make this call when you have time. Engage when it works for you. That's not something that government is actually set up to do. But we as a nonprofit can set up to do that. And so that's something we've done very deliberately. And so most of our power in policy suasion is in the fact that legislators all over the state are like, I got so many calls from people who came through California YIMBY, and they were in my district, and there were these kinds of people and those kinds of people, and I got emails. And so I'm sort of like, you know what? If we're giving them the way to do it, to engage in a way that works for them, for now, for me at least, that's success. Is it good enough? No. We could do. There's a lot we need to do better to like center the voices and make it look more like the people who are going to benefit. It's really, really hard. It's really hard. And so we're all. I'm open to ideas on how to make more of that happen.
I wanted to return to the question about property values because it seems like there's two separate issues. There's the one issue about if there's affordable housing coming in, will that reduce property values? And I think the empirical answer is no. But then there's the second, bigger point of this whole exercise, which is to make housing more affordable. So it is going to have an impact on the property values of people. And so how do you, am I not, I'm getting a quizzical look, so.
No, finish
No,
your
I mean, that's the point, is to make housing more affordable. So for an incumbent owner, their appreciation gains are likely to be smaller. So how do you answer that question? I have my own ideas about how I would answer it, and I'm totally on board with this whole program, but how do you answer it most effectively?
I mean, I try to be as anecdotal as possible with own experiences. So I mean, if you're local to DC, I used to live right across from Malcolm X Park in an apartment building. There are a ton of new apartment buildings that have been built there, mostly geared towards when I was in my 20s, those young millennials or whatever, and they weren't there. I loved the apartment but I lived in, don't get me wrong, but from time to time I check that apartment building. The rent has barely changed because so much has been built nearby. So that has de facto become affordable housing because I haven't lived there for 13 years and the rent is just about the same as when I left. That's a big deal. That's a highly sought after neighborhood near a ton of amenities on now a bus rapid transit line. And, you know, you don't see, I think every framing needs to be done with making clear the expectation to the community. These are not changes you will see in 1 month, in 6 months, in 1 year. Some of these take 10 years to really manifest. I'll never forget, we did a project in Los Angeles on homelessness, and we get there, and it was after the H and Triple H bonds were voted on, or approved. And when we spoke to the community members, they're like, yeah, well, we voted on this 6 months ago. We already voted on this. We already are spending our tax dollars on it, and I'm still seeing homeless people. I'm like, yeah, the tax actually hasn't even taken in place. Like, it hasn't started yet. And it was just an expectation, like, oh, I voted on this like 6 months ago. Why am I still seeing homeless people? So we really need to set expectations that a lot of these positive impacts, particularly for affordable housing, take a really long time. It takes a long time to build things. And then, yes, I mean, there is this tricky balance between you want affordable housing, you also want to maintain people's property values for their buy-in, and you want wealth generation for folks who are coming into homeownership. And I don't have the special sauce for that. I'll just admit that. I don't know what it is.
We can take one more question? Okay.
Hi, I'm asking on behalf of April, who is a virtual attendee. She says, what is your message to folks who, in one breath, lament the high cost of living for new grads and retirees, and in the next breath, fight housing? How do you message to those folks to address that disconnect? She also says, I'm looking at you, Connecticut, and hello, Jason.
Hello, April. I know at least a couple Aprils, so. Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, that is the crux of the issue that we face in Connecticut. I think it takes kind of those one-on-one, I don't know, this is not a public policy solution, this is like a human one, right? I think it just takes time and meeting them where they are and not accusing them of being one thing or another, even if they might be. And having that conversation with them and trying to break through to that, because I think they're operating in the fear of the unknown because we are such a segregated society that they don't know, and they were probably raised in a segregated community. They don't know how to interact. And I work in higher education, and we have students come from very wealthy places who don't know how to act with somebody who's, forget, African American or Latino, just even middle class, and don't know how to interact with each other, even if they're of the same race. And I think it's going to take a lot of human efforts, in addition to public policy being formulated, to help address that issue.
Okay. Well, please thank our panelists and thank all of you for your participation.